Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, we're starting a new series. We're calling it Fixing Democracy. I'm going to be speaking to a range of guests about the ideas that could change the way we do democracy and perhaps change it for the better. We're going to be talking about how elections work and about the ways in which they can be corrupted. We're going to be talking about how parliaments work, how government works, about the different ways that citizens can be involved, from referendums to citizen assemblies. We're starting with a conversation with the political historian David Klemperer, who is a research fellow at the Constitution Society. And he and I are going to be discussing the past, present and future of proportional representation. Are PR systems simply better? David, we're talking about proportional representation, and we're talking about it as a possible reform, improvement of democratic politics. So two things to say up front here. First of all, for that to be a plausible argument, it has to be in the context of systems that aren't PR systems. So apologies to people now who live in PR systems. We will be talking about their history and some of their merits and demerits. But the assumption here is that there are certain systems, I would say three prominent ones: United States, Britain and the lower house of the Indian Parliament, three of the world's biggest democracies in their different ways, which still use first past the post. And then the second caveat, I guess, is when you start talking about PR, people will often say, yeah, but it really depends what kind of PR you mean. And there's not just one thing, proportional representation. And I had a look at the Electoral Reform Society website just before we started. So they just, as a starter, list 9 different types, right? Everything, and we can come back to this at the end, everything you can imagine and some things you've never heard of, certainly that I'd never heard of. But from the perspective of first past the post systems, do you think it is possible just to talk about proportional representation as a reform? And before we get bogged down in the what kind, to sketch out the broader merits of the two types of system, what they are designed to achieve and also what they might fail to achieve. Do you think we can talk about PR before we start as a single thing? And I hope you're going to say yes, because if you say no, we've got a problem.
Yes, I think we absolutely can talk about PR as a single kind of system, because I do think all PR systems are based on a shared set of concerns and are in many ways trying to answer a similar set of problems. In the same way, I think you could say majoritarian systems, non-proportional systems, there are also varieties of different majoritarian systems, but they are also trying to answer the same kinds of questions. So for proportional systems, the logic of proportional representation is that the purpose of a parliament, of a legislature, is to reflect the political sentiments of the nation as a whole. And the metaphor that was often used by advocates of proportional representation in the 19th century was that Parliament should be the mirror of the nation. Sometimes people talked about, the image of the nation, a portrait of the nation, but there was always this idea that the composition of Parliament should reflect the political composition of the wider country. And proportional systems are all in their different ways designed to achieve that.
And we're going to talk about the 19th century, but again, I'm sure people will have in their heads immediately the thought, right, but that was a vision of the nation that excluded, for a start, women. So when we talk about the mirror of the nation, it means the mirror of the political nation as it was understood at the time. So there is a conception of a nation which is made up of active, participating citizens, and they are the ones who need to be reflected. It is not, certainly in the 19th century, a population-based conception of the nation.
That's absolutely right. And this was something that critics of proportional representation would often point out, would say, well, this image you're saying is out there that needs to be reflected in Parliament. There are many different ideas of what that could be. There isn't an obvious reason why the image that you want reflected is necessarily the image that ought to be reflected. But I think more significantly, opponents of proportional representation and supporters of majoritarian systems say, well, this basic principle is wrong. That isn't the purpose of elections. That isn't the purpose of representation. The idea isn't to reflect exactly the sentiments of the political nation. It's to elect a set of people who can perform a set of tasks, most importantly, forming a government and governing the country. And that perhaps requires a different set of processes to a set of processes designed to reflect the country as a whole.
And that idea of the mirror of the nation, even there are two ways of thinking about it. So we're going to do a later episode in this series on the question of quotas, particularly gender-based quotas, but other kinds of quotas too. The idea that what you need in a parliament are people who come from the different groups who make up the electorate. And again, in the 19th century, it's not obvious that proportional representation, whatever scheme you have, is going to give you that, in the sense that the kind of people who wind up in Parliament do still tend to come from certain classes, educational, in terms of wealth and other assets. So there are still two visions, aren't there, at work here of the mirror of the nation. One, it reflects preferences or choices, and the other is that it reflects types of people. PR is the first of the two things I described, not the second.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And I think what's interesting is the way that over the course of the 19th century, the proportional understanding of this comes to replace the earlier understanding of the mirror of the nation. The earlier understanding emphasizes balancing out different sociological categories. In Britain, that meant the variety of suffrages, school of representation, the idea that different areas should have different requirements for who gets to vote and who doesn't, so that you can achieve some kind of sociological balance in Parliament. In France, there was a huge interest in interest group representation. The idea that instead of being represented territorially, you'd be represented through different kinds of social categories. What proportional representation does is it takes the idea of representing the nation like a mirror, but suggests that rather than being about sociology, it's about opinion. And what comes from that is that, and I think this is something that many early advocates of proportional representation were uncomfortable with, but by being about opinion, it meant it was ultimately about party. And that is what proportional representation today is really about. It's about ensuring that the proportion of seats that each party has reflects that party's support in the country. So it's a move from a politics of sociology to a politics of opinion, and that's ultimately party.
So this to me is one of the really interesting things about the 19th century story. And I may have got this wrong, but you can put me right if I have got it wrong. So in Britain, say, as the franchise expanded across the 19th century in Britain, it's a majoritarian first past the post constituency-based system. One of its many problems was that some of these constituencies were a joke. They were rotten boroughs. There was no real contest there. But even in the constituencies where there was real competition for votes, one of the things that made people uncomfortable was the hold of party or partisanship and these incredibly fiercely fought contests in individual constituency just to win the prize. It was all about winning the prize. And it was felt that individual voters had a very pared down choice. Essentially, these people bullying you or bribing you this way, these people bullying or bribing you this way. And mid-19th century advocates of proportional representation, as I understood it, thought that it was a means of breaking the hold of, if not party as such, but this kind of vicious partisanship that you get in constituency-based politics, the sort of Dickensian view of an election where it's beer and bribery and violence, and then someone gets chaired through the constituency on people's shoulders, with people throwing their hats in the air. Proportional representation took the voters seriously as having preferences, opinions that might not be captured by the choice they were offered in their individual constituency. And in a way, it was thought by the people who pushed it in the mid-19th century to take the voters seriously as intelligent beings and not just the creatures of parties out to just grab their vote at whatever cost. I think there are lots of aspects of this story where it feels like the 19th century arguments have sort of been turned on their head almost. But is that right, that in the 19th century, the advocates of PR, particularly the British franchise was expanding, were trying to give the voters the sorts of choices they felt that the grip of party had denied them?
Yes, so I think that this is a very interesting question, partly because these kinds of tensions remain in debates around PR. But in terms of whether that's what they thought, that is what a lot of people thought in Britain. So Thomas Hare, who invented the most commonly advocated form of proportional representation in 19th century Britain, absolutely saw his system, which we now call STV, as a way to break the power of the party and have a much more individualized electoral system based on electors making considered decisions about which individuals they saw as most suitable for public office.
So STV is a single transferable vote. One of the premises of that was to break the hold of constituencies as well, right?
Yes, that's absolutely right. all proportional systems require a broader constituency than just a single member district, because you need to have a large enough area that you can proportionally distribute seats within it. And Thomas Hare, somewhat impractically, imagined that the whole country would be one constituency and that voters would be choosing individual candidates from across the entire country and ranking them in order. And that was a pretty extreme version of this. But there was definitely this idea in 19th century Britain that advocates of proportional representation saw this as a way to break the power of the parties. But I think there are two interesting things to note there. The first is that their opponents often disagreed that this is what it would do. They often said, actually, if you're going to do Hare's system and you're going to have the whole nation be a single constituency and voters are expected to rank all these different candidates, how are they going to know which candidates to rank? They're going to be relying on party machines that are telling them in what order to rank the candidates. And they also noted that this would be a politics of small interest groups. So Walter Bagehot famously argued that in Hare's system, every small religious group is going to have its representatives in Parliament. So that might not be a party as traditionally conceived, but it's definitely interest groups and machines are going to extend their power over the system, rather than what might have traditionally been seen as the relatively independent single candidate in a first-past-the-post district running on their own personality, their own record. You're going to have people standing as the candidates of different interest groups. And I think the second thing to note is that the debate in France about the relationship between proportionality and parties was very different. And once again, there was this idea that these small districts were somehow corrupt. But interestingly, that wasn't about parties. And in France, the argument went that what we have is a local, provincial, insular, very corrupt form of politics where people are being elected on the basis of local concerns and local reputations. Often this is kind of local notables exploiting their status within the community to get elected. And what we need to do is we need to nationalize politics. And we need to make politics not about small local groups, but about ideas. And if we have politics that's on a national level and it's about ideas, that's actually about creating political parties. So in Britain, proportionalists thought political parties have too much power. We need to break this with proportional representation. In France, they thought national level political parties don't have enough power. Politics has become dominated by these parochial concerns. What we need is to empower national level political parties by creating a proportional system where people will be voting at a much larger level and will be able to make votes about ideas and policies, not personalities.
And in the French case, is that an argument that goes back to the revolution and is a difference between France and Britain in the sense that I would imagine through the 19th century, part of that anxiety in the French case was not just the influence of local notables, but basically the influence of local priests. This is partly an argument about the Catholic Church, which the relationship between church and state in France dominates 19th century politics. But that is a version of the argument in the revolution, which is if you let the revolution take hold in localities on their own terms, sort of it goes out of Paris and into the countryside, the priests will come back. And the way to break the hold of the church is to literally nationalize politics. And that argument is not going to play in Britain because Britain has a national church of a very different kind.
Yes, but I think what's so interesting in France is that that argument ends up kind of flipping. So at the start of the Third Republic in the 1870s and 1880s, it's the left, it's the Republicans who support, it's not originally proportional representation, but larger national level list-based systems because they're worried about the influence of traditional local notables, priests and aristocrats. But then the Republicans get very good at working the majoritarian system, and you get a new kind of Republican elite that is able to dominate local politics, and it's an anti-clerical elite made up of lawyers, teachers, doctors. And so by the end of the 19th century, the proportionalist argument is very often being made by the conservative right, who say what's happened is that the natural leaders of society are no longer in charge because we've let these petty, provincial, small-minded men dominate through these corrupt cliques and networks. And if we renationalize politics, then the natural leaders of society will be on top again. And I think there's another point as well, which relates to the legacy of the revolution, which is that the French revolutionary idea is that every individual representative, as much as they're elected in a single locality, is meant to represent the entire nation. And it's a politics that doesn't acknowledge sectional interests. Whereas the proportionalists in France were arguing we need a politics that can understand that society is divided and can negotiate between those divisions. And so that's why we're going to have this national level party-based system so that we can negotiate between the different blocks in society. We can accurately represent them in Parliament and then negotiate between them.
We are going to come on to the 20th century. I promise people are listening to this. I got one more question about the 19th century, which is back to Britain. Someone who was very interested in some ways influenced by Hare's scheme, was John Stuart Mill. But Mill offers a version of proportionality which is pretty remote from the arguments today, but not completely. You still hear echoes of it. So the versions of proportionality we've been talking about are still individual voters who have equal shares or stakes in this polity, but then how they can distribute their preferences. But Mill became preoccupied with the question of whether actually the amount of votes you get should be proportional to your competence or your ability to vote. So he notoriously came up with a scheme where basically you got more votes the further up you were the educational hierarchy, in the sense that if you passed the civil service exam, you would get a lot more votes than if you had no education at all. And that the proportionality, therefore, should be at the level of the amount of influence individual voters should have. Most people in a democratic age think of that as elitist and snobbish in various ways, but you do still hear echoes of it. So I'd say probably the commonest echo of it you sometimes hear is the argument that people with children who can't vote should have extra votes. Parents, for instance, maybe should have extra votes. Or you could do it proportional to age. Kind of if you're 99 and you have less time on this planet, you get less in voting than if you're younger. Did that, in the 19th century, did that Mill version have any real purchase at all? It's an interesting argument. It's quite a fringe argument, but did it have teeth?
I think that the argument of combining proportional representation with plural voting had some teeth, essentially because plural voting, as Mill advocated it, and proportional representation were both answers to the same question, which is how do we ensure in this new democratic age that minorities, and in particular elite minorities, aren't swamped by this sort of new tide of working class voters. So both of these things are trying to answer the same problem. And in fact, the first country to actually introduce proportional representation was Belgium. And the franchise under which they introduced proportional representation was a franchise that had plural voting. So richer people, heads of household, business owners had additional votes. And so the first use of proportional representation in the world at the national level was roughly a million kind of system. It wasn't based on education, as Mill would want it, but it was a plural voting system.
How long did the plural part of it last in Belgium?
20 years.
Right. Ended with the war?
It ended just after the war, yes. They got proportional representation in 1899, and they abolished plural voting in 1919.
So that then leads on to the thing that I'm also really curious about, which is then the divergence that you get. So that's the beginning of it. And it more or less coincides with the advent of the 20th century. We now live in a world where majoritarian first-past-the-post systems are very much the minority. In the 19th century, there were very few democracies of the kind we would recognise, and some of the prominent ones for sure, and we've talked about Britain, France, and the United States, had these arguments, but majoritarian systems were the norm. Through the first half of the 20th century, I think it's fair to say proportional systems become the norm in most places that are creating democracies, not from scratch, but afresh in a way that didn't happen in Britain and the United States. Why? Why was the argument so effective in the first half of the 20th century, particularly in Europe, in the various European democracies that were being formed? Some of them then collapsed or were conquered, but reformed again. Why did PR have purchase on the continent?
So I think there are two answers to that question. The first is, I think, that we shouldn't overlook the extent to which proportional representation in many parts of Europe was simply felt to have won the argument and had made a very powerful intellectual case, especially in an age when politics was about social division in a very clear way. And if you have these European countries where you have working class organizations, religious organizations, sort of middle class interest groups, and politics is understood to be about the interplay of these different groups, then an approach to politics, an approach to democracy that says this is about ensuring all groups are represented fairly and then can then bargain at the parliamentary level was a very appealing and intuitive argument. So when, at the end of the First World War, a whole host of new democracies emerged, it made sense that they would turn to proportional representation as the system that they were going to use. The second answer is an answer that's more about cynical political maneuverings. And this is in countries that may be democratized in a more gradual way, where what happened was that as democratization progressed, you had the emergence of labor movements and of socialist parties. And for traditional elites, this was an existential threat. And the real fear became that one day these parties are going to win a majority, and that a majoritarian system is going to give them power to enact a socialist agenda. And in these circumstances, traditional conservative and liberal parties started to think we need to protect our interests. And there were different approaches that they could take. One approach that was sometimes taken was that these parties would merge, and they would say, well, if we all combine our forces, maybe we can still win under a majoritarian system against these new working class parties. But another approach was to change the system and introduce proportional representation so as to prevent the emergence of a dominant working class socialist bloc.
Was there resistance from the new socialist party? So I'm thinking of the British case here, where a majoritarian system exists. And one of the stories of the first half of the 20th century is the Labour Party, I think, keeping the faith that eventually it could be a majority party in Parliament. And that was a good bet, because in 1945, for the first time, not the first Labour government, but for the first time, there was the Labour Party in the British Parliament, the House of Commons, with a thumping majority. In the European case, was there not a calculation on the part of the socialist parties that we should resist this move because we are naturally the majoritarian parties, and we will never get what Labour got in Britain in 1945 if we allow this change to the system?
So these parties were often very divided on this question, and it essentially related to whether people in the party were thinking in more kind of long-term or short-term ways. Because in the short term, proportional representation was fantastic for socialist parties. Because when they were still small and growing, often the way politics works was you'd have a conservative party and a liberal party. And the socialist parties, to get a foothold in politics, had to make deals with the liberal parties. And often this was something they found very frustrating, very demeaning, and really didn't like having to do. They wanted a politics based on class, and here they were having to make alliances with middle-class parties. And so for many socialists, proportional representation was a way to break free and not have to make these deals and to be able to have an independent class-based politics. So in the short term, proportional representation was very, very appealing. And it was only some other socialists who said, well, in the longer term, this might work out for us. But it meant that there were actually big debates within these parties over how they should approach it. On the whole, socialist parties tended to support proportional representation, but there were certainly people within the parties who didn't. And in Britain, the Labour Party was very divided. So Labour's first Prime Minister, James Ramsay MacDonald, was a big defender of first past the post, but his Chancellor, Philip Snowdon, was an advocate of proportional representation. And this largely hinged on Ramsay MacDonald's confidence that Labour would eventually overtake the Liberals versus Philip Snowdon's hatred of having to deal with the Liberals in the short term.
And it is one of the features of first past the post systems that they can be very frustrating for parties for a long time, but they have a tipping point in them. So the Labour Party in the first half of the 20th century, before the Second World War, went from being a party with a relatively small vote share and a small number of MPs to a larger vote share, but nothing close to what would be needed for a majority, increasing numbers of MPs, but then having to form minority governments, all of the frustrations of that, all of the betrayals, the whole legacy of the story of betrayal in the British Labour Party. But then the tipping point in 45, suddenly you don't win all the seats, but you very nearly win all the seats. And other parties have been through this. The SNP, who we'll talk about in a bit in Scotland, go from being a party that's sort of pushing at the door to suddenly almost literally winning all the seats under a first past the post system. There are polls that suggest what might happen at the next British general election. And it is really striking how for reform, from 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34%, the change it can make, it's not clear exactly where the tipping point is, but from that frustration with the system to the winner take it all position, it's a small move. So it can take a long, long time to get there. But then the final step is often quite a small step. So then I want to ask about another phase in British politics, and this relates broadly to the question of whether majoritarian systems suit countries, polities that are two-party systems, or basically engineer it so that you're going to get a two-party system. So probably, I'm guessing, the low point in agitation in the British political system for a change to the electoral system and for proportional representation reform is through the 50s and the 60s. And the feature of the 50s and the 60s in Britain is that the dominance of the two parties, the two main parties, was almost complete. 90% plus of the votes in general elections in the 1950s went either to Labour or the Conservatives, and everyone else was squeezed out. And you could read this one of two ways. Either it's because Britain was naturally a two-party state, so this was a very good system for a naturally two-party state form of politics, or this system produced among the electors a view that almost all votes were wasted apart from votes for one of the two main parties. Is there any plausibility to the first of those two arguments, that actually there are some societies, political traditions where the two-party system makes a kind of sense, as it seemed to make a kind of sense in Britain in the 50s and 60s, and so majoritarian politics just suits those kind of countries? Or is it always a kind of reverse engineering thing, that actually the kind of two-party system you get is really a function of the electoral system that you have?
I think that there is some plausibility to the first case, but I think that the outcome is always an interactive effect. Political scientists have, I think, a very useful metaphor for understanding this, which is society is the accelerator and electoral systems are the brake. So divisions within society produce more parties, but electoral systems potentially limit how many parties you can realistically have. And I think that there's a good argument that first past the post might have been a pretty hard break in the 1950s, but that also there wasn't anything pressing on the accelerator at that time. And I think you can look at countries in Europe that did have proportional systems, like West Germany in the 1950s, which also had a relatively small number of parties. Not to the same extent as Britain, but, we had Labour and the Conservatives, they had Social Democrats and Christian Democrats. So I think that there is some case that even under a proportional system, politics in Britain in the 1950s and 1960s might not have looked that different.
Does that argument work the other way around as well, relating to what you were saying earlier about the fears of the parties of the right, that the left is a natural majority and there have to be breaks in the way of that? That under a proportional system, a society that might be moving towards a binary contest, say between Labour and Capital, the proportional system will work as a brake on that and will fragment it a bit, because it's harder for that contest to manifest as a straightforward binary choice at the ballot box. So it kind of gets diffused or diluted as it has to emerge in these different party forms. So in the same way that the majoritarian system is a brake on fragmentation, is the proportional system a brake on class war?
I think it can be, yes, but I think it really depends on the extent to which those other divisions are still very real and strong and strongly felt. So France had proportional representation in the post-war period, and the result was that they had a politics that was simultaneously divided by class, but also divided by religion. And it resulted in often very strange alliances where you'd have sort of economically conservative secular parties allying with socialist parties against often some quite economically left-wing religious parties allying with right-wing religious parties. And a lot of British observers were very frustrated and said that French politics would be much more rational if they could just organise themselves into two parties based on class, like in Britain. And I think they thought that that was a better, clearer system. But I think that it's unclear if that would actually have worked, given the strength of feeling about those religious issues.
Is there a parallel story to be told about the United States, or is the United States in this, as in some other things, a case apart? So the United States really has almost always been, apart from the points where the parties collapse and have to be reformed, a very strongly two-party system. But traditionally the view was it works because the two parties are such broad churches. The left of the Republicans used to overlap massively with the right of the Democrats. That's no longer true. There's been a big sorting effect. But when the system worked in the way it was traditionally understood to work, it worked because the parties were such broad churches nationally, but also they had so much regional variety in them. A Tennessee Democrat and a Massachusetts Democrat might not have much to do with each other. Did that dilute or basically crush the pressure for electoral reform in the United States? Was there an equivalent set of arguments in the US to the ones that were happening in Europe, say the ones that were happening in Britain through the 20th century? It never went away, this idea that there were serious flaws with the two-party system.
You did get some of those arguments, but I do think America is something of a case apart, largely just because of how differently parties are organized and how much traditional party forms that you get in Europe are effectively illegal in America because of the way in which parties are integrated with the state, especially through things like the primary system, that you couldn't form a party that has any control of its members in the way that a British political party could because of the requirements about internal party competition. So I think American parties are very different beasts to European parties, and that means that a lot of the arguments and a lot of the effects look quite different.
And also, it is possible in the American system for an outsider to come in and capture a party. We have just seen a fairly prominent recent example of that. And that was one of the anxieties in the European case, in those British arguments in the 19th century, that the party had that kind of hold, so that voters who wanted something different from the outside couldn't find it. In America, you can find it, and you can indeed run and win. Not always, not often, but it can be done. So in the British case, from the 1970s onwards, I think it would be fair to say the argument for PR has grown. It ebbs and flows, but there's been a sort of steady drumbeat of arguments that the system that we have, first past the post, is flawed. It is unrepresentative. The arguments tend to be driven by minority parties, and one of the things that's happened is minority parties have become more successful. And this is across the board. So there are the parties of nationalism, including the Scottish National Party. The Labour Party split in the 1980s, so that then created a dynamic among one half of that split, wanting a proportional representation, the SDP, then the SDP Liberal Alliance becoming the Liberal Democrats, but then the rise of the Greens. And now I want to talk about reform in a bit because I think it's an interesting case. What do you think was primarily driving that? Was that, again, actually just political pragmatism and, you might almost say, cynicism? Small parties are going to want a PR system, particularly the ones that believe they will never be a majority. I suppose Greens never believe they will win a majority in Parliament. Or do you think there's something more profound or even principled at work there?
I think if we're thinking about the rise of proportional representation as an issue in British politics over the last 50 years, say, we can really see it in three stages. So the first stage would be the 1970s, especially after the 1974 elections, that saw parties other than the Labour and Conservative parties win significant proportions of votes for the first time since the interwar period. And that firstly exposed problems with first past the post. It exposed the disproportionality of the system, but it also brought to prominence groups that, as you say, were invested in this issue. So the Liberal Party that got 20% of the vote and very, very few seats became much more prominent and was very, very vocal in advocating for proportional representation. The second stage is Thatcherism in the 1980s, which had a really big effect in how the British left thought about these questions. So as you've said earlier, the Labour Party had historically had a view of democracy and British politics that was very, very majoritarian. The idea is that the British state is a tool that the Labour movement could use. Majoritarian politics means that you can get a Labour majority government who will use the tools of the state to enact socialist policies. Now, the experience of Thatcherism in the 1980s has a really big impact here and leads to a lot of people on the left questioning this understanding. And you have the emergence of organizations like Charter 88 that begin making an explicitly kind of left-wing argument for political reform. And people on the left start to see the British state as perhaps not the kind of tool that they thought it was. They start to see it as something more outdated, more sinister, more authoritarian even. And this is partly related to the fact that Margaret Thatcher is able to enact very, very radical changes throughout the 1980s, despite never having a majority of the vote. And so a lot of people on the left, first past the post, goes from looking like a system that will enable a Labour government to bring socialism to a system that is allowing Margaret Thatcher to destroy everything that they had previously worked for. And I think you can see the influence also of arguments like Perry Anderson and Tom Nairn's essays about the British state. There was this big kind of left-wing case that Britain had never properly modernised, its state was outdated and imperial, and arguments about the first past the post become part of that. It's become seen as something that's calcifying British politics.
And there is also the feature of Thatcherism, which is Thatcher never won a majority of the vote, but in Scotland, a majoritarian system in Westminster can govern a nation, as it was seen by many people, where almost nobody voted for Margaret Thatcher.
Absolutely. And so what Thatcher inadvertently pushes on the left is an increasing interest in pluralism, decentralisation. Part of that is the left's embrace of devolution, which it then enacts in the 90s under New Labour. But part of that is also a greater interest in the idea of proportional representation. So I think that's the second stage that takes you into the New Labour era, when proportional representation isn't implemented for the Westminster Parliament, but is introduced for the new devolved parliaments. It's introduced for European elections. It's introduced in London, and it's introduced in local elections in Scotland as well. And then I think the third stage that we're possibly now in is, since 2010, I think you could say, the party system has progressively been breaking apart. We're seeing Labour and the Conservatives both struggle to hold on to their traditional constituencies. We're seeing the rise and fall and then rise again of the Liberal Democrats, the emergence of the Greens, UKIP and then Reform, Scottish nationalism, Welsh nationalism. And I think that in the context where the party system is breaking apart, it's very clear that first past the post isn't doing the job that its advocates say it does. It isn't forcing everyone into a two-party system. It isn't guaranteeing majority government. And it isn't holding things together in the way that it's meant to. And in this context, the argument for proportional representation has gotten a lot stronger, and it's won a lot more converts.
And is that the difference between what may have been true, say, in the 80s, which is from a two-party to a three-party system? There was a point in the mid-1980s, early mid-1980s, when the SDP was formed, where it looked like what was going on was actually the contest to be the other of the two main parties. And in the American system, that happens too. There are points in which there is a contest. And it may be that we are in one of those now between Reform and the Conservatives. We'll talk about that in a second. But what feels different now relative to the 80s is just the proliferation of parties. So that if you look at the electoral map, a possible map after the next election, it just has so many different colours on it. And these parties are not going away. They don't have ambitions to be a majority party of government, but there are a significant number of them. So it feels like it's a further fragmentation than just what might happen when one of the two big parties splits. That may be going on too, but this feels different. This post-2010 thing feels different from, say, the 70s and the 80s.
Yes, I think if we go back to the metaphor of social division as the accelerator and electoral systems as the brake, what we have at the moment is that the British public have slammed their foot on the accelerator to the extent that the brake no longer works.
I sometimes find myself wondering, so for instance, the 2005 election was one of these, whether there were some elections where the result would be so anomalous that it would drive a greater interest in proportional representation simply on the grounds that the British system can produce majority parties in Parliament, which have extraordinary power because of the way the British Constitution works, with almost no one having voted for them. So in 2005, Tony Blair won a majority of around 60, with roughly just over half of the people turning out to vote and just over a third of those people voting Labour. So essentially, only 20% of the electorate voted Labour. So if you got 100 people in a room and said, who here voted Labour? Only 20 people put their hands up. And yet there in Parliament was a Prime Minister with a big majority and very, very few checks on his power. And I remember at the time writing that this was going to produce a crisis of legitimacy, the kind of phrase that academics use that don't mean anything, and turned out to be rubbish because, as I remember it, there were a few rumblings and articles, I don't know, in The Guardian and elsewhere, but no one cared. My memory of it is that no one really cared. And I remember thinking at that time, crises of legitimacy are actually very rare in a system that is operating in a relatively prosperous, relatively peaceful society. And just to me at the time, it seemed obvious absurdity of that result. I mean, it just looked absurd. Didn't bother people.
I think it's something that struggles to break out of being a minority interest. And I think even today, proportional representation is, I think, an increasingly popular cause amongst people who spend a lot of time thinking about politics. But I'm not sure it has the ability to be a sort of populist cause, because I'm not sure when most of the public thinks about their dissatisfaction with British politics. I think there is a huge amount of dissatisfaction with British politics. I think we possibly are now in a crisis of legitimacy, but I'm not sure that crisis of legitimacy relates to the electoral system.
And the last election was more anomalous even than 2005 in the sense that Keir Starmer got 500,000 fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn got in 2019, but he ended up with a historically large majority, the smallest vote share of any party ever to win a majority in the British system. I'd learnt my lesson, so I didn't believe it was going to be. I remember on election night, people like Rory Stewart were sort of chuntering away and saying something here really doesn't add up. And I remember thinking, I've been there, and trust me, no one's really going to mind. They're going to mind about other things, but they're not going to mind about the fact that Labour have all the MPs, but very few people voted for them. So that then raises the question, what would it take to break the hold of the two main parties and to break this system? The obvious problem is that the people who have just won under this system, so it's quite hard to persuade them. Tony Blair was meant to be up for it in 1997, and then he discovered he had a thumping majority, and he realised there was both no need and it would look a bit ridiculous. What do you think would do it? So, for instance, if the next British general election produces not an ungovernable nation, because we're a totally governable nation, but an ungovernable parliament, some scenarios give you Reform as the largest party. No one wants to go into government with them. They could be a minority government, but they wouldn't get any votes through parliament. Putting together a coalition out of all the other parties would involve a grand coalition of Labour and the Conservatives. We have no tradition of that. They would still have to work with. It just doesn't work. So there are scenarios where post the next election, first past the post, can't produce a government. Now that feels to me like it would be a crisis of legitimacy. Would that do it, do you think?
I think quite possibly, yes. I think the best hope for proportional representation has always been a hung parliament in which a small party or a group of small parties is able to make the case for electoral reform and to make electoral reform the condition of their supporting the government. So the closest we came to electoral reform at the national level recently was the coalition government of 2010 to 2015, which was able to make as the price of their participation a referendum on changing the voting system. Not to a proportional system, to another majoritarian system, but nonetheless, they were trying to get a change to the voting system, and they were able to get a referendum on that because of coalition. And I think that in a future hung parliament, we could expect the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, potentially the new Jeremy Corbyn-led party to make as a condition of their support for a Labour government or some kind of coalition the enactment of some kind of electoral reform. And I think that there's another way in which the current political context is possibly conducive to electoral reform and to proportional representation, which is that I think if we look in the past, parties are able to put up with the unfairness of majoritarian systems. But what I think often leads them to move away from majoritarian systems is the uncertainty they produce. What you said earlier about the way in which just small changes in vote shares can lead to huge changes in which parties have which seats. And in moments of flux, when the party system seems to be changing, that makes first past the post a very, very unpredictable system. And I think that at a time like 2005, the parties of government know how the system works. They feel confident in their ability to manipulate it. But at the point of democratization, at the start of the 20th century, when new socialist parties were emerging, the traditional conservative parties, they were often still really benefiting from majoritarian systems, but they were very uncertain that they would continue to do so. And it was not the sense of unfairness, it was the fact that they were uncertain that first past the post would deliver particular outcomes. They didn't know how it would work with the rise of working class politics. It was that uncertainty that led them to electoral reform. And I think what we're seeing today with the kind of collapse of the party system in the UK is that first past the post has become an incredibly uncertain system. A journalist I was talking to the other day said the next election is going to be like a tombola. Every seat, voters aren't going to know who are the parties actually in contention. You know, if I'm a left-wing voter and I want to stop reform, should I be voting Labour? Should I be voting Liberal Democrat? Should I be voting for a new left-wing party? Who's actually the most popular party in my seat? If I'm on the right, do I vote Tory? Do I vote Reform? And I think that in that context, the case for proportional representation, if you're a kind of party strategist, becomes much clearer, because proportional representation is a system that, for all its different strengths and weaknesses, you do know what you're going to get. You know that if you get 20% of the vote, you'll get around 20% of the seats. What first past the post means is that when you have lots of parties all on roughly similar shares of the vote, you have no idea what you're going to get. And I think that for a political class, that's really threatening.
The other thing we should say is that for the first time in my lifetime, my memory, British politics also has scope in it for people to win constituencies as independents. It happened in the last election on a very small scale, but nonetheless, I mean, it's happened once or twice, sort of notorious cases, Martin Bell being one. But still, that 19th century argument that one of the things that first past the post does is it squeezes the possibility of outsiders or independents offering themselves up. It's happening under our system, but it's right at the edges, and it feels like it's more part of the strain to the system than it is part of, oh, look, the system's working because people can win as independents. I want to ask you about the referendum, though, because that's another subject we're covering in this series, which is the relationship between referendums and possible changes to how we do democracy. And in Britain, the experience of referendums recently has been scarring for politicians of pretty much all stripes. The Scottish independence referendum, the Brexit referendum, but also the AV referendum. It was a harrowing experience for the Liberal Democrats. That was the price they extracted for going into coalition. They lost the referendum, and then they more or less destroyed the party at the next election because they couldn't win, 8 seats, I think, under first past the post. So if the price of this is going to be another referendum, and it's an open question, but I think probably the assumption is this kind of change to the voting system would require a referendum to be enacted. I don't know if that's true. You can tell me whether you think that's true or not. But if the thought is it does require a referendum, that's going to give parties pause. Do you think the problem in 2011, I'm asking you a lot of different questions here, but do you think the problem in 2011 was what was on offer, which was AV? Do you think the problem was that actually people are pretty attached to first past the post? It's quite easy to make the case for it, which is the case is direct accountability of constituency MPs and a kind of kick the bastards out mechanism, which is very attractive to voters, particularly when they're frustrated with politics. That if there was a referendum on electoral reform at a time of growing dissatisfaction with politics and frustration, that people will not want to give up their opportunity to clear all of the bastards out and replace them with a new set of bastards. What went wrong in 2011? That's my simple question, within which there were lots of others.
So I think in 2011, the problem was what was being offered and who was offering it. So in terms of what was being offered, it wasn't proportional representation that was being offered. It was a system called AV, which is another majoritarian system, but it's a preferential system. So you can list more than one preference. And the idea is that any candidate elected in a given seat will ultimately have a majority of the vote. Now, I think AV is a system with a lot of merit in a lot of different ways, but it is undeniably a relatively difficult system to explain pithily, whereas proportional representation, I think, has the benefit of being pretty intuitive. Seats match votes. And I think that meant it was quite hard for the electoral reform side to make the argument, especially since most of them didn't want to be arguing for AV. They wanted to be arguing for proportional representation. And I think that really, really undermined their campaign, because at no point were they making an argument for the system they were supporting. They were making these general arguments about the need for reform. The second thing was it was being offered by the Liberal Democrats, who had just destroyed their popularity by going into coalition with the Conservatives. And so the kind of alliance that you would have hoped to assemble behind electoral reform, consisting of the Liberal Democrats and a large part of the Labour Party and the broader British left, and perhaps some of the Conservative Party, wasn't able to cohere because so much of the public hated the Liberal Democrats and didn't want to support anything that Nick Clegg was the face of. So I think it was what was being offered and who was offering it. And to answer your question about would PR in the future require a referendum, I actually think the answer is no. I think, as you say, the Brexit referendum and the AV referendum before it have been scarring experiences for people. And I think there would be a widespread desire to avoid going through that again. And I think what you've seen of late is the pro-proportional representation movement, the electoral reform movement, returning to kind of older models of how you achieve political reform. So in 1918, at the end of the First World War, we had a speakers' conference that made a set of proposals about the future of the electoral system. Interestingly, their initial proposal included proportional representation, but that was later removed. And what the APPG for Fairer Votes, which is now one of the biggest organizations campaigning for proportional representation, calls for is a national commission on electoral reform, which I think is an idea that you'd have a process that would build consents for reform, but I don't think that process is necessarily a referendum.
In the case of the AV referendum, I imagine part of the thinking behind the people who decided that is what would be offered in a referendum is that constituencies and the idea of constituency MPs is still pretty popular. In polling, people often say they don't like politicians, they don't trust them, but they quite like their own individual MP. All the others are bastards, but the one that they know locally, they're quite keen on. And I imagine actually the challenge, if there were a referendum, and I take your point that there might well not need to be, with a referendum on PR, would be for the opponents of PR to the ditch they would choose to die in is constituency representation. Not just because it has a long tradition in Britain, and because we are also in an age where local allegiances are strong in the face of discontent with national politics, but also just because I think a lot of people think that's the one bit of the system that still works.
I think that's right. I think that is where the debate would be. And I think interestingly, it would take you back to that original kind of 19th century question of what is it that we want to represent? Do we want to represent places or do we want to represent opinions? And the argument of proportional representation is that we should care more about representing opinion. And the argument of first past the post is that we should care about representing places.
So the last thing I want to ask you about is reform. So apologies to people who are listening to this not in the UK, but I think it's an important question, not just in Britain. Reform are a party that have come from nowhere, effectively. They now have, well, they have 4 MPs, don't they, because one has been suspended. They looked at the last election like the classic victims of a first-past-the-post system. On election night last year, I remember the exit poll predicted, I can't remember, maybe 15 seats for them, but even that was squeezed by the way that the system works. Labour won a lot of seats with very small majorities by just squeezing out the Reform candidates. So they look like a party who would obviously be in favour of reform to the system. And in a relatively short time, they've become a party that probably genuinely believes it has a chance of forming a majority in the House of Commons. I'm not sure if it does, but I can totally understand why you might believe that is now within the bounds of possibility. So the reform story looks like it might conform to that type which we've discussed, which is parties that are pushing at the door, but then suddenly they get close enough and they see the door might just sort of fall open without anyone having to do very much. And at that point, it's quite hard to retain your attachment to proportional representation. So my last question to you is, do you think in Britain, at least, this question actually really does now turn on whether reform are plausibly one of the 2 possible parties of government and whether Nigel Farage in particular believes that?
I think electoral reform now turns on what happens with the rise of reform and what it does to the party system. I mean, reform historically was always in favour of proportional representation. Nigel Farage has a long history of being very supportive of it. He was very active in the AV referendum, for instance. But in the last few months, I think we've already seen that reform are now much more ambiguous about where they stand on the electoral system. And I think that we could very well see them become steadfast defenders of first past the post. In which case, I could well imagine that proportional representation becomes a issue entirely about people's views of reform. And it becomes a kind of anti-reform position to support PR. And it becomes a pro-reform position to support first past the post. And I can imagine we could even see PR presented as a kind of anti-reform plot by the establishment to hold on to power. I think that could be quite an interesting dynamic to see.
And is it conceivable that either of the 2 main parties, in the Conservative Party, it's very hard to imagine the Conservative Party giving up its attachment to first past the post because it's just done so well historically, even though, as you said, there have been moments of real uncertainty and anxiety. But in a way, the point of the Conservative Party always was that it could ride those things out because it had a sort of historic institutional memory of its ability to adapt. Can you imagine a scenario in which either of the 2 main parties become advocates of proportional representation?
So in the case of the Labour Party, the Labour grassroots is already, I think, totally won over to proportional representation. Local constituency groups, party conference itself has regularly been passing motions calling for proportional representation. So your average Labour activist is already an electoral reformer. I think when it comes to the party leadership and the party elite, it's about that question of uncertainty. I think at the moment, they're quite confident in their own abilities to manage politics under first past the post, to find ways of winning under the system. I think they're very confident in their ability, to identify the target voters, to work out who they need to win and then win those places. I think they will come around to proportional representation at the point at which they start to doubt their own ability to sort of navigate those currents. And when things become so uncertain that they don't know exactly how to proceed, I think that's when they'll come around to proportional representation. And I do think that is relatively likely, maybe not this Parliament, maybe not even next Parliament, but I do think that will happen at some point. As for the Conservative Party, I think it's harder to see it happening because I think, unlike Labour, the Conservatives have kind of based their political identity around supporting first past the post to an extent. I think we saw that in the AV referendum. There was this idea that as the Conservative Party, they defend British institutions, including the electoral system. But I think the Conservative Party is currently in a much worse state than the Labour Party. They really risk, I think, total destruction. And I think that the experience of looking total destruction in the face can change any political party's opinions on electoral systems very quickly. I think we saw it with the Liberal Party at the start of the 20th century. David Lloyd George was the fiercest opponent of electoral reform at the time of the Speakers' Conference, at the time of the Representation of the People Act. And 4 or 5 years later, he had totally switched his position and come around to it when he saw what was happening to the Liberal Party. So it wouldn't surprise me if we did, in fact, see the Conservative Party embrace proportional representation.
A reminder that you can get tickets for the second film in our autumn season at the Regent Street Cinema. It's on the 25th of September. The film is My Dinner with Andre, and it will be followed by a live recording of this podcast with Lee Hall, the creator of Billy Elliot. Next time on Fixing Democracy, we're moving from electoral reform to parliamentary reform. I'm going to be talking to Hannah White of the Institute for Government about how parliaments can work better and whether they really are being sidelined by powerful executives. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.